I'm now joined in the studio by our Latin American correspondent, Antonia Lavender, who's going to tell us a little bit about our international story this week. That is the protests that are plaguing Southern America and Latin America in general, from Bolivia to Chile and Ecuador too. Thank you very much for joining us today, Lindy.
Thank you for having me.
So just tell us briefly about the situation in Latin America at the moment. It's a region known for protest, but they're getting quite severe and they're spreading from country to country.
Civil disobedience is deeply rooted in Latin America. It's a form of expression, and it comes from a passionate feel from the people. The fact is, protesting has worked to make some sort of change in the government, as it has with Ecuador now that the problem has been resolved because of the Decree 883, which would increase the cost of gasoline and fuel, and it ignited loads of protests around the country. The government was able to say, we are going to make a deal to break this apart and work together with the Committee of Indigenous Cultures in Ecuador and come to an agreement as to what we're going to do.
Some would say that these riots, they're rooted in not petty but some quite small issues, and then it leads to quite large conflicts that's leading to, or large riots that's leading to quite a lot of costs to human life. Obviously, I think it was the rise in public transport was one of the reasons for the starts of one of the protests. Why does such a small government issue lead to such a large social protest?
Because once some sort of issue arises, everybody wants to jump in with their own issues and their own ideologies in order to put it into a sort of melting pot of ideas to bring to the government. So we're not only looking for the fact that the rise in subway tickets might come into difficulties with people going to work and whatnot, but also the sexual harassment, the problems that are happening, and even police brutality, which also came about during the protests. And that's why the National Human Rights Institute now has over 58 legal actions against sexual harassment and violations, mostly from police, and then over 200 legal actions against torture and criminal injustices from the protests alone. And we're looking at the fact that police are also now abusing human rights due to the fact that they are targeting people's eyes and eyesight. 217 cases of the people that were injured, out of the thousands that were injured, were people who had eye injuries, and loads have gone blind.
Obviously, the main goal for many of these countries is they want to try and change the regime that's in power in these Latin American states. And we've seen it for many years. This change from the alt-right to a more left-wing government in power. Why is there such radical changes between the regimes that rule these countries?
The best way to respond to this, I would say, I would look back to Octavio Paz, a famous Mexican philosopher, who stated that, at least in the Mexican community, but it could be applied to the rest of Latin America, people tend to want radical change instead of change that is made slowly, or instead of pinpointing a specific problem within the government or society. They want to eradicate the entire government altogether and start anew with a different type of government.
Often when you've got a domestic issue such as a protest, one solution to the government's problem, their internal problems, is to try and make an enemy out of someone inside the state or out someone outside of the state, inside or outside of the state. So, for example, obviously you can look at the United Kingdom. When Margaret Thatcher wasn't doing too well, she made a big issue out of the Falkland War. And so, I mean, right now what we've got loads of different countries that have got really severe domestic civil issues, civil protests. Are they going to make an enemy out of each other in order to try and distract from the real issue? Obviously, we know that, for example, the relations between Bolivia and Chile aren't the best. Bolivia have got that deep-rooted, that historical argument about wanting a bit of coastline. I think they're one of the only countries in the world that's got a navy, that's a landlocked state. Do you think that we could see these civil unrests become something more continental and disputes between the states?
I definitely think that when it comes to the idea of an external and internal enemy, it comes from populist undertones that the country has always had since the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with all of the dictatorships, and that just prolonged to kind of via an identity to whomever comes into power. You always pinpoint an enemy. But that shouldn't hinder the relationship between countries, because Latin America in general, even though there could be economic restraints between one country or another, it never even gets close to being a conflict. There's a huge cultural unity within the entire region. So it would never even, I don't think it would develop into being any kind of problem in the future. I think it would be a discussion or some sort of discourse in between a country, but never something to actually worry about.
What will it take to resolve these protests?
Well, we're seeing obviously the different outcomes. You have Chile, who still hasn't come to terms with what's happening. We're in month 2 of the protests. Ecuador has been able to resolve it. And now Bolivia is the most strenuous of all 3, because they've lost their president, who was pushing constitutional limits for a 4th term and then obviously committed electoral fraud. So the results are all very different, and it depends on how far the protests push the government to do what they want to do. Obviously in Bolivia, it's worked to get rid of a fraudulent almost dictator, some people are calling him. But now the protesters are still convoluted in this problem. They're still protesting, even though Evo Morales is now in Mexico.
Well, thank you very much. That's really interesting. That was our international Latin American correspondent, Lindy Lavender.